From having to grow up without his father to guide him, to channeling the loss of his girlfriend into the greatest role of his career, this is the dark side of Keanu Reeves' life that no one ever talks about. I gotta say, the guy's not had it easy. For one thing, his father abandoned him when he was still a young boy. That's enough to leave trauma that'll last a lifetime. But his dad, Samuel Nolan Reeves Jr., was also a pretty mysterious figure. Keanu himself admitted that he barely knew anything about him, which makes sense given that he was barely around during his formative years. All Reeves knows is that his father was living in Beirut in the 1960s, where he met Keanu's mother, Patricia, and it ended up being the start of a very troubling story. You see, Samuel left his new family shortly after the birth of his second child, Kim, aka Keanu's sister. The Hollywood star was just 3 years old at the time, and I can't imagine the toll this abandonment must have taken on him. Now, he did see his father occasionally over the years, but these visits got increasingly rare as he grew older. Eventually, Keanu decided to cut his father off, and it was for one very good reason. His dad had become a drug dealer after leaving his family. Around the time Keanu was an up-and-coming actor back in the 90s, Samuel Reeves got arrested with heroin and cocaine in his possession. This led to a decade-long prison sentence. And even though he only served 2 years, being behind bars probably led to his relationship with Keanu becoming even worse. Now, if there's one thing we can say about Keanu Reeves, it's that he tends to keep a cool head in interviews. You rarely ever see him lose his temper, yet whenever he talks about his dad, he seems to get pretty riled up. Keanu's gone so far as to say that his dad is a bit of a loser. Even when his dad tried to reach out when he got out of jail early, Keanu simply refused to answer his calls. He was a pretty big star in the mid-90s while his dad was trying to get in touch with him, so you might assume that he was just being petty. However, you should know that his refusal to acknowledge his drug dealer dad has a bitter story behind it, and it all has to do with how his career started off in the 90s. Things were going really well for him thanks to the Bill and Ted films, along with a bunch of other notable roles. Now, one of these roles was in the black comedy called I Love You to Death, and it was while working on that film that he met his best friend, River Phoenix. That's Joaquin Phoenix's older brother, by the way, and if you think Joaquin's an amazing actor, you should have seen River in his prime. Now, Keanu and River were both grappling with the desire to get taken more seriously as actors, so they decided to work together on their next project, which turned out to be the art house classic, My Private Idaho. The pair became really close while working on the film, and it ended up becoming a landmark moment in the history of queer cinema.
Can't get the bike started. Cops are coming, stuck in the middle of nowhere. Yeah? With a stolen bike. Yeah, Mike. Looks like this is the end.
Keanu followed this up by signing on for the lead role on Speed, which would end up taking his career to the next level, and River was slated to appear in the iconic Interview with a Vampire, but that's when tragedy struck. While Keanu was on the set for Speed, he heard some shocking news. His best friend River had just died of a drug overdose. Just picture what that would have been like for a second. Like, the guy's career had only just started to take off, and I'd imagine he was looking forward to his friend River coming up alongside him, but instead he found out that the guy he'd admired so greatly was gone forever. You see, River had started to get into some heavy drugs around the time he worked on My Private Idaho, and he'd developed a reputation for hard partying at the notorious nightclub known as the Viper Room. Keanu was absolutely devastated when he heard the news. This also kind of explains why he was so hostile towards his father. Remember, his dad got out of jail not too long after Rivers had died, and when Keanu learned that his own father had sold the same drugs that killed his best friend, he must have had a hard time even thinking of the man, let alone talking to him.
Mike, you're my best friend.
I know, man. I know I'm your friend. We're good friends, and it's good to be, good friends. That's a good thing.
You see, Keanu's never really forgotten about Rivers. He still tears up while talking about him all these years later. In fact, he's often said that it's hard to refer to River in the past tense. Mind you, this is decades after all of this went down, which just goes to show that Reeves lost a part of himself the day River died. Now, he had to move on sooner or later, and considering that he'd starred in The Matrix years after River's death, you might think that things ended up getting better for Keanu. He'd already decided that he didn't want a relationship with his drug dealer of a father, and the death of his friend at the hands of these drugs probably played a role in that.
You'll handle us. You know your predecessors had much more respect.
What's more, right before he started working on The Matrix, he met someone that changed his life, namely Jennifer Syme. She was a production assistant for the legendary filmmaker David Lynch, and she was also good friends with the controversial shock rocker Marilyn Manson. Syme and Keanu met at a party back in 1998, and for the first time in years, it started to look like Keanu might find some happiness. But it just wasn't meant to last. Not long after they got together, the pair announced that Syme was pregnant. It should have been a happy time for Keanu, all things considered. He'd just become the biggest movie star in the world thanks to playing Neo, and he also had a baby on the way. Unfortunately, in December 1999, Keanu and Jennifer's baby was stillborn. It was the latest in a string of tragic losses that Keanu had faced during his life, and it led to him and Syme splitting up. They just couldn't handle the grief at first, but tragedy has a knack for bringing people back together, so a couple of years later, they decided to rekindle their relationship. Once more, Keanu looked like he was on the brink of something truly wonderful, but I get the feeling that the guys cursed or something, cause even this reunion ended in tragedy shortly after it began. In April 2001, Syme went to a party hosted by Marilyn Manson, and while shock rocker was notorious for his crazy lifestyle, Jennifer clearly knew how to party too. Eventually, it seemed like she needed to call it a night, so Manson had someone drive her home. However, for some strange reason, Jennifer decided to go back to the party. She was extremely intoxicated, and she ended up crashing into 3 different cars with such force that she was practically flung from her seat. Unfortunately, Jennifer died instantly, and Keanu ultimately had to deal with yet another loss. Just like his feelings about River, Keanu's never stopped missing Syme. He's not one to talk about himself much, but despite that, he spoke of his love for the people he's lost in perhaps the saddest interview of all time.
I lead a very quiet, normal, kind of, really, I mean, my private life is a boring disaster, but work is good.
Good, I'm glad. I don't think it probably is a boring disaster. I think it's absolutely fine.
Speaking to Parade back in 2006, Reeves got pretty poetic when asked about all of the losses he's suffered. According to him, grief might take different forms, but it never goes away completely, and that despite what people might think, there's just no getting over the loss of a loved one, no matter how much time passes by. Despite all the darkness, Keanu has still managed to have a spectacular career, and he channeled his countless losses into bringing one of his most iconic characters to life. You know who it is. The unbeatable assassin, John Wick. Look, Keanu's never said it explicitly, but he's often stated that the character's deep grief is one of the many things he loved about playing him.
See, that's why you're special, John Wick. I wouldn't have stopped. It's good to have you back.
He's even said that he related to that feeling of grief sticking with you, and based on everything he's gone through, you can see why he'd feel that way. As for his love life, Keanu's quietly been dating a visual artist by the name of Alexandra Grant for over a decade now. I guess he was able to find happiness after all. So from the loss of his girlfriend and the way it made him relate to John Wick to an absentee father that left his kid to become a drug dealer, this was everything you need to know about the dark side of Keanu Reeves.